In Unit 4.1, we're going to be talking about light and quantized energy. We've talked a lot about different types of models, and we focused primarily on the Bohr model and the arrangement of the atoms. So let's talk about Ernest Rutherford. This particular scientist described atoms as a tiny, dense, positively charged core, which is what we see as the nucleus, and all of that mass was primarily concentrated in the nucleus, and light, the negative particles, which are called electrons, would be circulating at some distance, moving around, basically like how the planets revolve around the sun. And during Rutherford's experiment, what he did is he shot alpha particles at a piece of gold foil, and then from our experiment that we did in class, we realized that some of those particles passed through the gold foil and others were reflected, others bounced off. But most of the alpha particles went right through. And that showed that the gold atoms were mostly empty space. Some of the particles had their paths kind of bent at different angles, and a few of them bounced backwards. But the only way that would happen was if the atom had a small, heavy region in the center, which was going to be the nucleus. So it's going to be positively charged nucleus. So that didn't explain, though, why the electrons didn't crash into the nucleus. So as scientists began to unravel the chemical puzzle, they realized that there were certain things that didn't square with the understanding that Rutherford and other scientists had worked on. So in the 1900s, there was some research with different elements and looking at visible light. And they realized that Rutherford's model couldn't explain the differences between different elements that you had and the different properties that were exhibited in those. So an example of what we see here is argon in this light bulb, steel wool in the chlorine gas here, and potassium in oil. So the way that these three elements are related, the argon, the chlorine that has the steel wool in it here, and the potassium, is that those are all three numerically in the same order on the periodic table. However, they have very different properties, especially the reactivity, or in the case of argon, the unreactivity. So the arrangement of Rutherford's understanding didn't really align with how the elements were arranged on the periodic table and their different properties. So scientists knew that there was something that they were missing. So let's take a look at the electromagnetic spectrum, because the spectra helps to kind of understand this quantization of energy. So you may have talked about the electromagnetic spectrum when you were in maybe 6th grade or sometime in middle school. So the electromagnetic radiation is going to be a form of energy that has wave-like motion. Visible light is going to be a part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but it's only going to be a small part of it. There are a lot of other types of wavelengths of light that we can't see. The electromagnetic spectrum is going to be showing sort of a range of all the different types of electromagnetic radiation. So you see a couple different things that are going on in this image. You have the wavelength, and the wavelength is going to be the shortest distance between two equivalent points on a continuous wave. So the wavelength would be from here to here, or at the trough from here to here. So that'd be an example of wavelength. And it can be measured in meters, centimeters, or nanometers. Frequency is going to be the number of waves that pass at a given point per seconds. So the higher frequencies are going to be here, but those are going to be the shorter wavelengths. And on the opposite side, we're going to have the longer wavelengths, but it's going to be the lower frequency. So there's an indirect relationship between the wavelength and the frequency. The longer the wavelength, the lower the frequency. And the shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency. So there's a direct relationship between energy and frequency. So high energy, high frequency, low energy, low frequency. There's a term that we haven't talked about yet, and it's photons. So our STEM photo means light. And so a photon is basically just a particle of light. So it's going to be a particle, or sort of a packet of energy. It doesn't have mass, and it's going to be referring to a particle in the electromagnetic spectrum that carries a quantum of energy. It carries a specific amount of energy. So remember, the higher the frequency, the higher the energy. So a photon is going to be able to describe how light travels in both wave-like motion and also in particle-like motion. The photoelectric effect is going to be something that you have seen before in different examples or different applications. So this is when certain wavelengths of light strike a metal surface, some of the electrons are ejected, and those electrons that are ejected, that are kind of knocked off the surface, are going to be referred to as photoelectrons. And it has to be a high enough frequency of light to eject the electrons. Otherwise, the electrons are just going to stay there. So, for example, solar panels, that's one application. And also, you may or may not have seen these before, solar calculators. The atomic emission spectra is going to be a way that you can help to identify different elements. So a spectrum is going to be looking at the intensity of light that's emitted over a range of frequencies. And spectra are unique. They are unique to specific elements. So you can see this either when you run electricity through a spectral tube that contains a gas, for example, or when you view the particular element through a prism. When light from it is passed through a prism, then you can see the spectra that are emitted. So if you look at this example, this is a spectral tube that's containing helium, and when it passes through this slit, this opening here, it's going through a prism in this case, and as that light passes through, it separates, and it separates into this pattern that we see here. And this is helping to identify helium. So because each element emits its own unique spectra, then we can use that spectra to identify different elements, or elements that are composing a particular substance like a star, and that helps to use that spectra as basically a chemical fingerprint to identify different elements. And you may have heard of Roy G. Biv when you were studying electromagnetic spectrum, maybe in middle school. So Roy G. Biv is referring to the continuous spectrum. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So this is arranged in order of increasing energy. So in this case, from left to right, we're going to be going from lower energy to higher energy. But as we're looking at different spectra or using our spectral analysis, you're going to see this backwards in some cases. So it's going to be Vib, G, Yor. And the reason why this is backwards is because this is arranging the different wavelengths of visible light based on the wavelength in nanometers. So going from 400 nanometers to 800 nanometers. So this arrangement is looking at the wavelength from lowest to highest, whereas Roy G. Biv is looking at increasing energy.